Ladies and gentlemen, there is a moment in every life when the world stops, a voice silences, a presence vanishes, the echo of what was haunts the silence of what is. This is grief, not merely sadness, but a rupture in the soul. And though it comes for each of us, few know how to face it, and even fewer how to rise stronger from its ashes. Today, I will walk with you into the shadow, not to remain there, but to understand it. For only what we face can be transformed, and grief, if faced with courage, can become a gateway to a deeper, more powerful self. Let us explore this journey in 6 steps. There is a moment in every life when the winds cease and the silence roars. A moment where the soul finds itself untethered, suspended between what was and what no longer can be. It is not always marked by funerals or black veils, not always attended by the finality of physical death. Sometimes the deepest deaths are not of bodies but of dreams, the deaths of futures we once saw clearly, the unraveling of identities we thought were ours, the sudden disappearance of a relationship that once defined the center of our universe. And in these moments, the soul mourns, quietly, desperately, truthfully. Grief is the inner landscape of a shattered map. It is the unconscious responding to a world that has changed while the ego desperately tries to hold on to the image of what was. The loss of a person, a dream, or even the self we once revered must be acknowledged with the reverence of sacred ritual, for in ignoring it we do not escape the pain, we prolong it. Like a child hiding from the night under a blanket, we pretend safety. But the monsters of grief are not fooled by our pretense. They sit at the edge of the bed, waiting for our trembling acknowledgement. To say, "This has happened," is no small act. It is the courage of the soul awakening. These words are not weak. They are forged in fire. They echo not just in our minds, but in the deepest chambers of being, where instinct and emotion coil together. The psyche must grieve what has been lost, or the loss will fester in the shadow. It will bleed into our words, our choices, our health, and our dreams, until we are but a ghost, haunting our own life. Acknowledgement is not about intellectual assent. It is not a checklist item on the path to recovery. It is not something we do because we are told it is necessary. It is something the soul demands. It is the primal moment when the wound is seen, not hidden, when we speak the truth, even if our voice cracks. When we allow the tears to fall, not just from the eyes, but from the heart, the tears that say, "I have lost something sacred." In the rawness of that moment, we begin the alchemical transformation. The grief named and honored becomes a crucible, and in that crucible the false self begins to burn away. The image we constructed, the persona we curated for the world, these too may be casualties of loss. And rightly so, for the death of the old self is not the end but the threshold, a doorway that leads to what is more true, more whole, more real. Maya Angelou once spoke of the breath that returned after her mother's death, but she returned as someone different. That difference is not a weakness, it is evolution. Something dies and something deeper is born. In that moment we meet the soul beneath the mask. We meet the one within us who is not broken by loss, but redefined through it. And yet, how many of us resist this journey? How many distract ourselves with noise and movement, thinking we can outrun the silence? But silence is not our enemy, it is our mirror. It reflects back the shape of our grief and the contours of our longing. And if we are brave enough to look, truly look, we will see not only what we lost, but who we have the potential to become. The avoidance of grief is the avoidance of growth. And while the ego may plead for comfort, the soul cries out for truth. To deny grief is to deny ourselves the sacred descent into the underworld where transformation begins. There is wisdom in darkness and healing in sorrow. There is a kind of sacred madness in mourning, a temporary undoing of the self that opens us to the mysteries of being alive. In acknowledging grief, we also reclaim agency. We take back the part of us that was given over to the illusion of permanence. we begin to see that everything we love is both eternal and fleeting. Eternal in its impact on the soul, fleeting in its form. To love is to risk, to dream is to dare, and to grieve is to stand naked in the aftermath, whispering, "It mattered." We live in a world that fears grief, that demands we move on quickly, that measures strength by how little we cry. But this is a lie. True strength is the courage to feel, to stay present in the devastation, to sit in the ashes until the first green shoot of rebirth makes itself known. Not forced, not faked, but real, fragile, and sacred. When we acknowledge death, whether of a person, a dream, or the self, we enter the territory of the sacred. We walk through the fire and come out not unscathed, but transformed. We shed the skin that no longer fits. We step out of the illusion that we are in control. And in that surrender, we touch something divine, a depth of soul that cannot be taught, only lived. Grief, then, is not an enemy. It is not a punishment. It is the soul's way of clearing space for what is yet to come, of calling us back to authenticity, of reminding us that we are not machines, but mysteries, that the heart does not beat in logic, but in poetry, that we are here not to avoid pain, but to be changed by it. So let us say the words, let us acknowledge what has happened, let us speak of the loss without shame, for in that honesty we do not crumble, we begin again. Not as we were, but as we were always meant to be, a little more human, a little more whole, and infinitely more alive. We live in a world that is obsessed with appearances, where polished surfaces are valued more than the raw, trembling truth that lies beneath. It is a world that teaches us to mask our pain, to paint over our sorrow with platitudes and forced smiles, and to carry on as though nothing within us is unraveling. We are told again and again, be strong. But what does that really mean? Strength, as it is often misunderstood, has become synonymous with suppression, an armor against feeling, a resistance to vulnerability. And yet, what if strength lies not in resistance, but in surrender? What if the deepest courage is not in turning away from the shadow, but in walking straight into it? There is a shadow that lives within each of us, a place of discarded feelings, unspoken memories, and wounds too painful to voice. This shadow is not the enemy, it is the part of us that has been exiled, the part of our humanity that we have learned to deny. In denying it, we fragment ourselves. We begin to split our identity into what is acceptable and what must be hidden. But the soul, wise and unrelenting, does not forget what we bury. The soul remembers. It whispers through our dreams, speaks in the language of our anxiety, and aches through our bodies when words cannot reach. A man once came to me, hollow-eyed and exhausted, carrying a grief too vast for language. He had lost his son, his child, his future, his hope. But instead of grieving, he performed. He smiled through tears he never shed, joked when silence would have been more honest, and told himself that life must go on. And so it did, but in a muted, lifeless way. His body grew ill. His marriage began to falter. He became a stranger to himself. When he finally collapsed into sobs, unguarded and raw, he said something I will never forget. I felt alive again. This was not weakness. This was resurrection. This was the soul after a long winter remembering how to feel the sun. Feeling is not indulgence. It is not chaos. It is not a threat to the rational mind. Feeling is the bridge between the conscious self and the depths of the unconscious. It is the voice of the soul breaking through the noise of civilization. And to deny that voice, to call it weakness, is to deny our very humanity. There is a sacredness in sorrow, a holy truth in pain. To grieve is to honor what was lost. To weep is to cleanse the space where healing can take root. But we are afraid. We fear being seen in our pain because we have been told that pain makes us less. We fear being vulnerable because we have learned that vulnerability invites shame, and so we learn to disassociate. We become performers, mirroring what the world wants to see. We smile when we want to scream. We nod when we want to run. We numb ourselves with distractions, with substances, with perfectionism. But the soul cannot be tricked. It waits patiently. It waits for the moment when we will no longer deny it voice, and when we finally break, when the facade shatters and we fall into the arms of our own aching truth, then the healing begins. Grief, sorrow, rage, these are not errors in the system, they are messages. They are the sacred messengers of transformation. When we feel them fully, when we let them speak, we allow ourselves to evolve. The fire that consumes us is also the fire that purifies. The tears that flood us are the same waters that soften the hardened soil of our hearts. We must learn again how to be with our own pain, not to fix it. Not to judge it, but to sit with it, as we would sit with a dear friend who has lost everything. We must listen, we must breathe, we must feel without running. This is the work of wholeness. This is how we reclaim what we have cast into shadow. Because every feeling we bury does not die, it waits. And when enough of our feelings go unheard, the soul begins to withdraw. We feel disconnected, anxious, and lost. The world seems flat and meaningless, and we wonder why we no longer feel alive. It is because we have stopped listening to ourselves. Feeling is not just a personal act. It is a radical act in a world that tells us to shut down. It is a way of saying, I will not abandon myself. When we allow ourselves to feel, we become more human. And in our humanity, we become more connected, not just to ourselves, but to others. There is nothing more intimate than shared sorrow, nothing more healing than to be witnessed in our truth. The shadow within us longs to be known. It is not our enemy, it is our guide. It is the part of us that remembers what the conscious mind cannot bear to hold. And when we turn toward it with compassion, we find that it does not seek to destroy us, but to awaken us. Every feeling, no matter how painful, is a portal to deeper understanding. Every wound is an invitation to return to ourselves. And when we return, we do so with greater strength, not because we have conquered our pain, but because we have dared to feel it. Let the tears come, let the anger rise, let the sorrow speak. There is no weakness in this, only truth, only the fierce grace of being fully alive. When we stop burying the shadow, we stop burying our capacity to love, to connect, to grow. We open ourselves to the full spectrum of life, not just the light, but the darkness that gives that light its meaning. This is not easy work. It is the work of courage. It is the work of those who dare to live with their hearts wide open. And in doing so, we do not become fragile. We become unbreakable, not because we cannot be wounded, but because we are no longer afraid of the wound. We have made peace with the shadow. We have reclaimed the language of the soul. And through that reclamation, we have remembered the one thing that can never be taken from us, the fullness of our own humanity. Pain arrives not as a punishment, but as a profound revelation. It tears through the surface of our ordinary lives, dismembering what we thought was certain, and exposes the deeper layers of the psyche that we often ignore in the rush of daily existence. In that exposure, though raw and unwelcome, lies the threshold of transformation. When we suffer loss, particularly the kind that rips through the fabric of our hearts, we are brought face to face with the eternal questions. Who am I without what I've lost? What part of myself went with them? And, perhaps more pressingly, what is asking to come alive in their absence? We have been conditioned to treat pain as an intruder, to numb it, escape it, bury it beneath distractions or accomplishments. Yet in the older stories of humanity, pain was understood differently. It was revered as a sacred teacher. In myth, heroes wandered into wilderness after suffering a great blow, not because they were fleeing, but because the silence of the woods, the solitude of mountains, the stillness of rivers allowed them to hear what grief had to say. The external retreat mirrored the internal descent. Suffering did not signal an end. It marked a passage, an initiation into a deeper self. What if pain is not something to conquer, but something to converse with? What if the ache we feel is the voice of a neglected truth? Too often we try to skip to healing, rushing toward the restoration of what was, rather than standing in the fire of what is. But that fire does not merely consume, it transforms. In its heat, the old identity, the one that relied on attachments and roles, begins to fall away. In its place, something ancient and essential begins to stir. I remember the story of a woman whose husband died in a sudden accident. In the aftermath, her world fell apart. She could barely speak for weeks, but in her silence she began to write, not about the pain but through the pain. Every morning she sat with her journal as if her soul had more to say than her voice ever could. At first, it was only sorrow that poured onto the page, a torrent of unanswered questions and raw confessions. But slowly, subtly, another voice began to appear. It had been hidden for years beneath routines, responsibilities, and roles. It was the voice of the dreamer, the creator, the forgotten child who once believed in stories. She published a novel a year later, not a story of death, but of emergence, of becoming, of remembering who she was before the world told her who to be. Grief, then, is not only about mourning what is lost, but about uncovering what remains. It is the slow, painful peeling away of what no longer serves us, and the invitation to rediscover the self that lies underneath. We often think of loss as the closing of a chapter, but rarely do we understand that something greater may be trying to write itself into our lives through that very loss. In the space left behind by absence, something holy often takes root. When we grieve, we open. Our defenses, so carefully constructed, fall. Our pride gives way to vulnerability, and in that sacred vulnerability we touch something timeless, the capacity to feel, to love, to see beyond the veil of the material world. That is why grief feels like drowning. It pulls us into depths we do not understand. But in those depths we sometimes find pearls. We live in a culture obsessed with happiness, but happiness rarely teaches. It is pain that carves the channels through which wisdom flows. When life feels unbearable, the soul is often closest. There is no mask in sorrow, no pretense. The wound makes us real. It strips away illusion and leaves only what is essential. It asks us not to explain, but to experience, not to justify, but to surrender. There is an old wisdom in recognizing that some of the greatest awakenings begin in silence and suffering. The oak becomes mighty not in the comfort of gentle breezes, but through withstanding storms. So too with the human spirit. When everything is stripped away, titles, possessions, even loved ones, we are asked to confront the essence of our being. What remains when all is lost? That question is not the end of the path. It is the path. Ask not why the pain has come, but what it reveals. It may show you a fear you've refused to face. It may uncover a dream long buried. It may remind you of your limits, or challenge you to surpass them. The pain is never random. It is precise, piercing the very place in us that is ready to grow, though we may not yet believe it. And growth rarely looks like triumph. It often begins with falling apart. In that breaking, something ancient wakes. Some call it soul, some call it spirit. It is the part of us that does not die, even when the body breaks or the world crumbles. It is the voice that says, begin again, even when you cannot see the path. It is the whisper that urges us toward the life we were meant to live. Not the life others expected, but the one encoded in the quiet chambers of our heart. To explore the meaning of pain is to honor its depth. It is to step out of the role of victim and into the role of seeker. It is to ask, what is this trying to teach me? And to listen without needing the answer to come quickly. Meaning often emerges slowly, like dawn after a long night. But it does come if we dare to stay awake through the darkness. You are not alone in your pain, even when it isolates you. Grief can feel like exile, but it is also a bridge. to others, to yourself, to a greater purpose. The stories we carry from our losses become medicine for those who follow us. Our scars are not shameful, they are signs of survival, maps that lead others out of their own darkness. When you ask what the pain is teaching you, you begin the process of turning sorrow into strength. You learn that your heart, though broken, still beats, and perhaps it beats more truthfully now, more in tune with what matters. With each tear, a layer falls away. With each breath in the midst of despair, a new seed is planted. What appears to be the end is often the beginning of a deeper becoming. Pain is not the enemy, it is the portal. Step through it with courage, let it break you open, so something greater can rise. In the modern world, where the clock ticks louder than the heartbeat and efficiency is praised above reverence, something sacred has gone missing. The silent rituals of farewell, the small, symbolic acts that once held the soul through grief, have vanished into the static of our digital lives. Yet, beneath the surface of our well-lit cities and busy schedules, the psyche still cries out for what it once knew intimately, ritual, not as routine but as reverence, not as tradition but as transformation. For it is through ritual that the soul speaks its deepest truths, and it is through ceremony that pain finds its rightful place in the story of who we are. There is a peculiar kind of suffering that arises when loss is left unmarked. It is as though the psyche, having endured a wound, searches desperately for the scar to tell it that healing has begun. But when no scar forms, when there is no ritual to shape the grief, then the pain remains amorphous, haunting, and unfinished. We are left drifting in a sea of invisible sorrows, unsure of where one chapter ended and the next begins. It is not enough to move on. The soul cannot simply be instructed to forget, to bury, or to get over what it has cherished and lost. To do so would be to amputate part of one's self and expect the rest to flourish. No, the soul demands acknowledgement. It demands that we pause, that we bow our heads to what was, and that we give form to the formless ache within. Ritual, in this way, becomes the language of the unseen. It is how we tell our inner world, this happened, and it mattered. I recall the story of a couple who had suffered a miscarriage, a quiet tragedy that the world rarely knows how to speak to. There were no casseroles delivered, no cards or flowers, just an invisible emptiness where a life might have been. But rather than let their sorrow dissolve into silence, they created a ritual. They planted a tree in their backyard, a living symbol of the child they never held. And each year, on the same day, they sat beneath its branches and lit a candle. It gave us a place to bring our love. They said, how profound, not just a place to bring grief, but love. Because ritual is not about mourning alone. It is about memory, about continuity, about the sacredness of what was. The tree did not erase their pain. The candle did not bring the child back. But in honoring their grief with ceremony, they gave it shape. And in giving it shape, they gave it dignity. Too often, our grief is left to wander like a ghost, unwitnessed and unacknowledged. But when we ritualize our farewells, when we create a sacred container for our sorrow, we invite that grief to rest. We no longer push it into the corners of our consciousness, but allow it to be fully seen and felt. Only then can it begin to soften, to change form, to alchemize into something meaningful. Symbolism, you see, is the native tongue of the unconscious. It does not respond to facts or deadlines, but to image, metaphor, and gesture. It listens when we light a candle, write a letter, or place a beloved object into the sea. These acts, seemingly small to the rational mind, speak volumes to the deeper self. They say you are not forgotten. They say you mattered. And perhaps most importantly, they say, this is where we part ways. One need not follow any prescribed format to create such ritual. There are no rules, only intentions. Perhaps you write a letter to the one you lost and burn it beneath the stars. Perhaps you walk alone through a forest, leaving behind small offerings of what once tethered you to a dream now gone. Perhaps you build a shrine in your home, a place where memory can live in peace. These acts do not pretend to fix what is broken. Instead, they honor the brokenness. They meet the wound with reverence, and in doing so, they begin the process of healing not from, but through. There is great power in choosing to grieve consciously. When we ritualize the farewell, we reclaim authorship of our sorrow. We step out of the numbness that modern life so often offers in place of true mourning. We say, "This loss will not go unnoticed." We say, "I will not let this pain become a stranger in my own heart." In that moment, we become witnesses, not only to the event but to ourselves, and in bearing witness, we begin to transform. To give pain a ceremony is not indulgent, it is essential, because pain, when left unspoken, does not simply disappear. It festers, it hardens, it disguises itself as cynicism, anger, anxiety. But when we meet it with ritual, we allow it to soften. We allow it to speak its name, and often what it says is not only "I hurt," but also "I loved." There is no grief without love. Ritual, then, is not only a farewell to pain, but a recognition of love's enduring echo. Let us not allow the machinery of modernity to rob us of our sacred instinct. Let us remember that we are creatures of myth and memory, that our souls crave symbols as our bodies crave air. The ancestors knew this well. They danced their grief into the earth. They painted their sorrow on cave walls. They named their dead and sang them into the afterlife. We may no longer dwell in caves or gather around fires, but the fire still burns within, and it needs tending. So give your pain a ceremony, mark the moment, create your ritual. It need not be grand or public, only honest. Let your sorrow be seen by the part of you that longs for meaning. Give it a beginning, give it an end, not to erase it, but to embrace it, not to forget, but to remember well. For in that remembering, in that sacred pause between what was and what will be, we rediscover ourselves, not broken, but reshaped, not weaker, but wiser, and in that space, the soul, having been witnessed, begins to sing again. When we grieve, it feels as though something within us has been irretrievably torn away. The familiar contours of our inner landscape shift, becoming foreign and strange. We say to ourselves, sometimes aloud, often silently, "I don't know who I am anymore." These words echo through the chambers of our psyche, a lamentation and a bewildered plea. We mourn not only the person or thing we lost, but the version of ourselves that existed before the grief took root. That version dies with the loss, and in its absence, we are cast adrift in unfamiliar waters. This disorientation, though harrowing, is not a final rupture. It is the tremor that precedes a deeper transformation. The moment of loss is the threshold of an initiation, not one chosen, but one demanded. In this crucible, the surface self, our ego, our curated identity, is cracked open. Its defenses, long relied upon for safety and self-definition, collapse under the weight of grief. And in that collapse, a hidden doorway opens. What stands behind that door is not another mask to wear, nor a polished reinvention to parade before others. It is the raw, unresolved, and often uncomfortable part of ourselves, the shadow. It is that which we have pushed aside, denied, ignored. In times of stability, we could afford to look away. In grief, we can no longer pretend it isn't there. It calls to us with a voice both haunting and familiar, a whisper from the depths. There is more to you than you know. The shadow is not evil, though it may contain pain. It is not our enemy, though it often speaks in the language of fear and fury. It is the part of us that contains what we were not ready to face. The wounds, yes, but also the strengths forged in silence. In the shattering of grief, this shadow reaches toward us, not to consume, but to be integrated. To reject it is to remain fractured. To accept it is to reclaim the lost part of ourselves. We often think healing means returning to who we were. But what if the journey is not about going back, but about moving forward into greater wholeness? When something precious is taken from us, we do not simply bounce back. We are changed, and that change, if faced courageously, becomes our alchemy. Like the coal that, under pressure and time, becomes the diamond, our pain becomes the material through which something rare is formed. A self no longer bound by illusion, but made durable by truth. Consider the lives of those who have walked through the fire and emerged luminous. Viktor Frankl endured unspeakable suffering in Auschwitz. In that abyss he discovered a light, the will to find meaning. He did not escape pain. He met it with open eyes and refused to be reduced by it. He famously wrote, "When we are no longer able to change a situation, we are challenged to change ourselves." This is the call of grief, not to escape the darkness, but to allow it to transform us from within. The resilient self that emerges from this transformation is not a product of force or denial. It is born through surrender, not to despair, but to truth. In the grieving, we meet the limits of our control, the finitude of life, and the inevitability of suffering. These are bitter truths, but in accepting them, we access a power deeper than illusion, authenticity. And from that authenticity, we build a new center within, one capable of holding contradiction and chaos without losing its coherence. Grief demands that we sit with what is unresolved. It strips away platitudes and easy answers. In its presence, we are forced to ask the questions we once avoided. Who am I when all is stripped away? What truly matters to me now? What am I meant to become in the wake of this loss? These are the questions that guide us inward, where the shadow waits with trembling hands. We cannot become whole by amputating what we dislike in ourselves. We cannot grow by pretending we are unscathed. To truly heal, we must gather all the pieces of ourselves: the rage, the sorrow, the regret, the love, the memory, and bring them into a new harmony. This is not about perfection. It is about integrity. It is about claiming the full truth of our experience and allowing it to inform, but not imprison, our identity. Those who emerge from the grief journey transformed are not those who denied their pain, but those who faced it without flinching. They wear their scars not with shame, but with reverence. These marks are sacred. They are the evidence of battles endured, lessons learned, humanity embraced. We envy their strength, but what we truly admire is their courage to descend into the underworld of their own soul and return bearing gifts of insight and empathy. In reclaiming the lost parts of ourselves, we do not just find healing, we find depth. The world may applaud surface strength, the appearance of holding it all together, but the deeper, quieter revolution is the one within. It is the moment we decide to stop running. It is the moment we sit beside our grief and say, "Teach me." It is the moment we realize that our suffering, though devastating, is not meaningless. It is the ground from which we will rise. We are not meant to remain shattered, but neither are we meant to rebuild ourselves in the same form. The path forward is not restoration. It is integration. And integration means accepting all of who we are. The parts we show and the parts we hide, the joy and the pain, the light and the shadow. Only in doing so can we walk forward with a sense of inner solidity that no external circumstance can shake. Grief is the gateway, the shadow is the guide, and the self that emerges on the other side is not lesser, but greater, expanded, ennobled, capable of bearing life in all its complexity. This is the true triumph. Not to be unchanged by sorrow, but to be deepened by it. Not to forget what was lost, but to carry it with us as we become more than we ever thought possible. You do not need to be who you were. That self has served its purpose. Now, the invitation is to become more of who you truly are, shaped not in spite of the pain, but through it. Stronger not because you were unbroken, but because you broke and then chose to rebuild. This is your initiation. This is your becoming. Grief is not merely a private ache hidden within the recesses of the heart. It is a threshold, a liminal space between what was and what will be. In the deep waters of sorrow, one might believe they are cast adrift, left alone to navigate a storm that no one else can see. Yet grief, in its secret architecture, holds an invisible map, a map not to isolation, but to communion. The wound we carry is not a sign of weakness, but an opening. Through it, others may enter. Through it, we find that we are not alone. The psyche, when broken, retreats. It pulls inward, drawing its energy away from the world like a wounded animal seeking shelter. It is a natural motion, a protective gesture of the soul, but the danger lies in remaining there, in mistaking the wound for the whole self, and in allowing that wound to become a wall. That is the shadow side of grief, the illusion that no one could possibly understand, that the pain is uniquely ours, that we must carry it in silence. Yet what is required is the courage to lift the veil and walk toward others who have also been marked by loss. To grieve is to be remade. Something dies, not only the beloved, but the version of ourselves that existed in relation to them. The world shifts on its axis, certainties dissolve, time fractures, and in this raw and disoriented state, the soul cries out, not for answers, but for connection. And here lies the deeper purpose of grief. It does not come only to tear apart, but to initiate. It tears down illusions of separateness and invites us to find kinship in our mutual fragility. There is a strange and ancient power in sharing sorrow. When two people sit together in grief, they are not merely exchanging words. They are building a bridge across the abyss. In the presence of one who truly listens, who does not seek to fix or diminish the ache, a subtle alchemy occurs. The pain does not vanish, but it changes shape. It breathes. It loosens. It begins to carry meaning. The other becomes a mirror, reflecting back not only our grief, but our strength. In their recognition, we are reminded that we still exist, that we are still seen, and perhaps it is in the act of witnessing that the greatest healing unfolds. For to witness is to validate, and validation is the soul's salve. When our grief is seen, heard, and held, it loses some of its sharpness. The story begins to settle into the body like an old scar, no longer raw but not forgotten. We become storytellers then, not of tragedy but of transformation. We begin to speak the language of the broken-hearted, a language older than words, carried in the tremor of the voice, the softness of the gaze, the stillness between phrases. And in this storytelling we find the first hints of gold. In the Japanese art of kintsugi, shattered pottery is not discarded. Each crack is lovingly traced with precious metal, so that what was once broken becomes more valuable than before. This philosophy does not hide the damage, it sanctifies it. Our pain, when honored in community, becomes such a crack, visible, real, and yet radiant. We do not erase the breakage, we illuminate it. And in doing so, we teach others that beauty and brokenness are not opposites. The tribe of the broken-hearted is not bound by geography or language. It exists in every culture, in every generation, in every quiet glance exchanged between those who carry loss. To find them is not always easy. It requires vulnerability, the willingness to reach out when the heart feels brittle, the courage to speak when silence feels safer. Yet when we do, we find that the others are already waiting, not with solutions, but with presence. Not with platitudes, but with the quiet understanding of one who has walked through fire and lived to speak of the ash and the rebirth. This is the deep wisdom that modern life often forgets, that healing is not a task to be completed alone. The myth of the solitary hero collapses in the face of real sorrow. It is not rugged independence that saves us, but the outstretched hand, the open circle, the shared meal, the long pause where no one speaks, but everyone feels. In these moments, we are stitched back together, not perfectly, but authentically. Our seams gleam with the golden thread of others' compassion. The return to connection is itself a rite of passage. Having descended into the underworld of grief, we emerge not as who we were, but as who we are becoming. The grief remains, but it changes hue. It softens. It becomes a teacher, and through it, we come to know others not as strangers, but as fellow travelers. We begin to recognize the glint of kintsugi in their eyes as well. We must not wait for healing to be complete before we reach out. It is in the reaching that the healing deepens. In opening the circle to others, we remind ourselves of our own wholeness. The grief we carry may have bent us, but it has not broken us. And when we sit in communion with those who carry their own stories, we do more than share pain. We generate hope. We reclaim the thread of belonging. We affirm that love, though wounded, is never wasted. Let us then step across the bridge, not as beggars seeking solace, but as initiates who carry sacred scars. Let us find the others, not just for comfort, but for revelation. In their presence, we discover the vastness of the human heart, how it can break and still beat, how it can carry both loss and life, how, in the company of those who truly see us, we are mended not with denial, but with gold. So, how do we face grief and come back stronger? We acknowledge, we feel, we listen, we ritualize, we rebuild, we connect. Grief is not a curse, it is a passage, not one we asked for, but one that, if we walk it with open eyes and an open heart, leads not to despair but to depth. To all of you carrying pain tonight, you are not alone, and this story is not over, because the soul, like the seed, must first be buried before it can bloom. Thank you.